So, Richard, you arrive in Australia at an interesting time with a newly elected Conservative government, and we've got a Senate report recommending the adoption of the WHO report on social determinants. What do you think the government should do to take up this agenda?
Well, I think there are a number of different things. And in the poorest areas, I think it's important to provide services. So particularly support for families, young families. We know that childhood poverty has really important long-term effects. The problem, though, with tackling these problems through services alone is that the problem is endlessly recreated. So, you know, it is sticking plaster, but you need the sticking plaster where society is falling to bits, as it often is in the poorest areas. But the long-term solution is to reduce income differences. And you can do that in quite different ways. People always think it's just a matter of taxes and benefits, and of course there's a lot of resistance to that, though I think we've got to stop tax avoidance, we've got to deal with tax havens, and of course finance ministers of many countries, including of the European Union, have started to tackle that problem. I think more important is that, in a way, the bonus culture, the runaway incomes at the top, which have made our societies more unequal, is really a reflection of a lack of any democratic constraint at the top. You know, the difference between CEOs and production workers in, well, I'm thinking of a paper on the 350 biggest American companies, the differential between the CEO and average production worker was about 30 or 40 to 1 around about 1980. By early this century, you know, early 2000s, it had grown to 10 times that size. So we're talking about 300 or 400 to 1. And that is a lack of any democratic constraint, and we have to deal with it by building in democratic constraints. So many countries, many of the European Union countries, unfortunately not Britain, have legislation requiring employee representation on remuneration committees and so on. For instance, in Germany, if a company has more than 2,000 employees, half the members of remuneration committees have to be employee representatives. There are different thresholds for different sized companies. So that kind of legislation is really important, and reducing the income differences before tax, rather than just relying on redistribution through taxes and benefits. As well as having legislation requiring employee representation on boards, we must have also, I think we must back other forms of greater economic democracy, you know, employee share ownership, employee buyouts, cooperatives, all those kinds of companies, and they have much smaller income differences. I mean, you know, you might think your boss should get twice as much as you might even think 5 times as much as you, but you won't think 300 times as much. And in a sense, the next big sort of development, I think, in human emancipation is to democratize the economic sphere, to extend democracy into it. You know, if you think of businesses, they exist to create the goods and services that we all need, but they are also constituted as ways of concentrating wealth and power at the top, and they don't have to be like that. Well, people like Michael Marmot, who spent their whole careers in research, very detailed, meticulous research with large research departments, they aren't making ideological statements that are unrelated to the research evidence. They're making those statements because of the research evidence. But actually, you know, I as a student, was fortunate enough to have courses with Sir Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science. And one of the things he pointed out is that it's not the sources of the theories that have to be unbiased, it's the methods of testing them. And that is why, you know, you put forward research proposals that are assessed by your peers before they're funded, and when you report on your results, again they go through peer reviews, and the whole thing about research is, you know, that you have to produce methods that are not subjective, are not going to be influenced by bias and so on. I think it's hard to know whether a statement is ideological in the sense of unrelated to evidence, or whether it's coming from somebody who is making the statement because they know the evidence in great detail. And when people dismiss, for instance, social determinants of health, you know, we've seen in endless reports, simply hundreds, the scale of health inequalities in one society after another. People have controlled for all sorts of behavioural factors. That explains some of the differences in health, but the differences in life expectancy, and you probably find in major Australian cities that rich and poor areas may have a life expectancy difference of, say, 7 years. Some of that will be behavioural factors, but most of it, the research suggests, is not. And it does seem to be sensitive to things in early childhood, to income differences, social economic factors like that. People often think that it's all about medical care, but in the very big Whitehall studies of civil servants, following up first 17,000 office-based civil servants and then another one following up 10,000, they found threefold differences in death rates between senior and junior office workers amongst people who at that time were receiving very similar medical care in our National Health Service. It's not that medical care is unimportant. It's that the benefits of medical care are overshadowed by differences in incidence of cancers and heart disease and so on. And those differences in incidence are affected by the kind of lives we lead and the socio-economic conditions we find ourselves having to deal with. We often think that these sorts of issues are, there's an element of, well, they're more acceptable to one side of the political divide than the other. But actually, I think there's a fairly widespread and perhaps fairly fundamental agreement on this kind of society we all want. You know, nobody wants a society with more crime and violence. Nobody wants a society where community life is weaker. We all think those sorts of things are important, and I think nobody really accepts the huge differences in life expectancy and death rates between rich and poor. We know this is unacceptable. The arguments, I suppose, are about how you respond to these differences, and that's a matter of getting to know the research. And no politician, no responsible politician should make decisions which just ignores the research. It's no good being just denying the evidence of decades of research around the world on the social determinants of health, any more than just denying what vast numbers of meticulous projects on climate science have told us. You know, these things, it's just irresponsible to ignore a vast amount of accumulated evidence. And even in my own field, talking about the effects of income differences, there are about 200 papers in the peer-reviewed journals now looking at population health in relation to the extent of income inequality. There are about 50 papers looking at the tendency for violence to be more common in more unequal societies. And in many of these, we understand not only that there is that kind of relationship, but also what the mechanisms are. So, for instance, violence becomes more common in more unequal societies because violence is so often triggered by people feeling disrespected, humiliated, loss of face. And in a more unequal society, we judge each other more by social status. And if people are denied access to the jobs and cars and housing and good incomes and so on, they become very sensitive to, you know, are you disrespecting me, and so on. So if we want to produce the society that we all know is a better society, it's flagrant irresponsibility to ignore this evidence and just to think that your off the top of your head opinions that you happen to grow up with, which are based on often prejudices that haven't been exposed to that detailed scientific evidence. You know, no politician should be doing that. I think traditionally people interested in health have worked rather separately from people interested, I don't know, in criminology or reducing violence or child well-being or mental illness, you know, any of these different problems, drug addiction, but they all have common roots in relative deprivation. We now know they're all more common in more unequal societies. And so when talking to politicians, it's important to say, you know, don't just do this because it produces better health, but actually it'll help children's educational performance as well. It'll reduce prison populations, it'll reduce levels of violence, it'll deal with some of the mental illness. That, you know, there are many problems that have the same sort of pattern, and policies that help produce one will make a difference to others too. So basically you're saying that the bang for the buck is much bigger.